Hi, welcome to the Come Off Conqueror show. I'm your host, Bonnie, and I'm here today with my good friend Mike in his home office, which is pretty fun to have a change of scenery. And today we're having a continuation of last week's conversation about what is a perfect parent. Last week, we talked about being a perfect mom and how we don't have to be perfect to be the perfect parent for our kids. And in the course of making that video, we had some interesting discussion going on behind the scenes with some of our viewers. And it was brought up, what about abusive parents? What about those of us who make some pretty big mistakes, right? The whole point of last week's video was to talk about how God has given us our kids. And so we have this, and he trusts us to raise our children. But sometimes we don't always make the best choices while doing that. And so the question was brought up, what about abusive parents? Are abusive parents the perfect parents for those kids? So I had been thinking, how do I address this? You know, that's a really sensitive topic. And there's no right or wrong answer to that. I think there's going to be a lot of opinions about this idea. And then a few days ago, I was talking to Mike about this at his house, and I thought, man, Mike's kind of the perfect person to interview about this topic because he's been through a lot with his parents growing up. I'll let him give his backstory, but if anyone can talk about rising above abusive parenting and coming out on top and figuring out whether or not those types of parents are the perfect parents for you, I think it's him. So without further ado, let's hear about Mike's story and his take on perfect parents. So Mike, thanks for being here. Really appreciate this. I know it's uncomfortable to relive some of this. You really have been through a lot. And ever since I've known you, when I first met you, I had no idea that there was any of this crazy history because you are so put together. You have a successful business, you have a beautiful family, an amazing wife who's one of the most incredible people I've ever met. Beautiful family, you live in a nice home. You know, you'd never know that you had to rise from the ashes. So tell us a little bit, take us back to a little bit about what your parents put you through, I guess, and how you rose and what you've learned about parenting.
Well, there's quite a bit, but I think to stay in focus, I'm sure we're going to have more than one interview. You can't say no to Bonnie for more than 6 months. But I think it's good therapy, and I watched your video on the perfect mom, and it sounded like a home run to me. And so I thought I'd talk about some things that focused on that with my mother.
Okay.
There's a lot of history, but this focus on the one item is my mom. She passed away almost 3 months ago. And I didn't know. She never called, never. And we're estranged. I'm estranged from my family. The only family I really have are my identical twin sisters. They're a year younger than me.
Okay.
But she reached out to my sisters to say goodbye. And they found out for the first time that she had lymphoid cancer. And that's what took her. But some particular stories that I think, as any mother, and when she met Ernie, that's my natural father, that was her second marriage. And her first 4 set of kids were pretty much train wrecks. One of them was I believe a suicide. 2 of them were drug addicts. One of them disappeared, and the other one was just never part of the picture. And I never really met any of them. At a young age, I can remember meeting one. Mom was raised in a Catholic orphanage, and she was separated from her family, from her father, because of abuse. And So part of what I'm going to talk about is coming into play is mental health and mental wellness. I feel strongly that there was some mental issues there, emotional mental issues.
Sure, she had a rough start to her life too, it sounds like.
She was a survivor, from what I believe. When I think about it, her first marriage was a very violent marriage, and like what most moms do that try to survive, they leave that, and they don't leave that lifestyle, and they hook on to someone that's a little different type of violence. And other interviews we'll talk about my father and the crime family type things that went on. But growing up, she would always tell us how special we were, and I learned after a while that it was part of the manipulation, but I didn't realize it because you're young and innocent. But there's several abuse stories where she felt like she made a mistake. There's several stories where she absolutely didn't make a mistake. She was in the right. But how do you compare your own lives of how you think you're parenting as a mother, sometimes to listen to the extremities of the worst, because mine is pretty bad, but there's a lot worse out there, where children's survive neglect, just out and out neglect. Okay, so my sisters, Michelle and Janelle, they're a year younger than me. They had a disability learning. Okay. We moved a lot. When we weren't running from things that my dad did with crime, we were never in the same school more than a year. But I remember in Vero Beach, Florida, this behavior that was sudden and scary and terrifying. I want to say we were sixth, seventh grade, but report card day came, and of course my sisters had a hard time learning, and that's when the beatings began. Is if you came home with something other than an A, you were beat with a jockey whip. And a jockey whip is, if some of you watched horse racing,
horse whip.
Yeah, that's what you see the jockeys tapping the horse whip. But I can remember this goes on for a couple of years.
Was it your mom who beat them or your dad?
It was a combination of both of them.
Both, okay.
Yeah. So the vivid memories I have was just the sheer terror of not getting an A or not getting your homework done. Because I remember just vividly when one report card day we came home, Michelle and Janelle, they wet their pants on the bus because they knew what was going to happen. And we lived in a condominium that was right on the beach. This is when my dad had accumulated a lot of money, so we were living fairly wealthy at that time from monies that he had taken from people. And I could just remember the terror of going up to our condo, punching in our code to get in through the security gate and knowing what would happen. And they would be waiting there with their arms crossed, waiting for the report cards. And I think I had a few B's, so, I got striped. We call it striping. It wasn't only the horse whip that they used. They would use a racquetball paddle that in those days they were wooden and they drilled holes in them. And I could just remember my sisters being absolutely terrified because they had all D's or F's. And they would be screaming. Mom would be dragging them back in the living room. I would be locked into my room. And so every day after that first report card day, coming home and doing homework was just an absolute hell. Because if you didn't have your homework done, or if you didn't do whatsoever, it was hell to pay. And that went on for an entire year. And that was shortly after we got out of private Catholic school when we lived in Louisiana. We moved from Louisiana to Vero Beach, Florida. But that stuck with me for many years. And whether their intent was to use overwhelming punishment and the consequences of punishment to excel, to get A's, I would like to think that that was their guideline, but it was awfully strange that it was just out of the blue. And it went on for a year through 4 report cards each quarter. And I guess when you have a major screw up like that in parenting, because I don't advocate that, I think that's horrible. What I gained from it as a survivor was to work very hard in school, but it was always out of fear, so I was always a straight A student. Even when I played basketball, I struggled to continue to make the grade, even though my sisters continually struggled because of their learning disability. And they used to read backwards.
Oh, so they had dyslexia.
Yeah.
Was it ever discovered? Like, did your parents ever figure out what was going on?
I don't have a clear memory of that,
Okay.
but I know the beating stopped at one time when we moved from Vero Beach to Okeechobee, Florida.
So for whatever reason, it only went on that 1 year.
Yeah, that was
Interesting.
intensive for school grades. There were beatings for many occasions that we'll talk about, with the jockey whip and disciplinary, and we weren't members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they literally believed in spare the rod, spoil the child. They literally believed in that. And
The other way around.
yeah, right, the opposite. Yeah. And so that was one of the defects or the side effects or whatever you want to call, is that I excelled at school. I excelled at memorizing things because I had to, and I was scared to death, because even after we moved from Vero Beach, they would constantly probe, if you're not getting your grades up, we're going to go back to the way it was at the beach. So there was always that threat. There was always a threat there. And when you're young like that, and you've got that constant pressure when you come home every day to perform, or else, there's going to be a punishment, and usually one that hurt. There's something wrong, with the emotional and mental makeup of a family unit.
Did you, because of this constant fear of not like being perfect in their eyes, perfect grades, perfect whatever, did that give you any sort of, I can see how that would benefit the school, right? You got good grades, you tried really hard and things like that, but I can also see how that would play into your self-esteem. And did you feel like if you weren't this model of what they wanted, that you, like, did that affect you in that way?
I think at that age, you don't really think about your identity, because you're trying to figure out who you are before you even know what to figure out. You're just in 6th and 7th and 8th grade, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it played a part of my psyche, because even in my world with business, it's always been do or die. I'm going to make it work, or I'm going to die trying. And that's an awfully hard route to take, especially when I have a better half that has lived through that with me, Angie. But there's some positives to that. I do a lot of weapons training in the military. There's a lot of pain instruction that goes on, and there is some truth to that, but it's not what a loving Heavenly Father does to us.
Right.
Heavenly Father doesn't approach us at the end of every day with a brow beating, or a physical beating. How'd you do? What'd you do? Why didn't you do this? Okay, go line up, go touch that wall and bend over. So
how did your parents' parenting impact your parenting as a parent?
Well, Angie came from a very nonviolent physical family. Their parenting technique was talking. My experience was violence, and the older we got, the more violent the interactions became, because Ernie wanted to break our will, and he used to train Dobermans for police force, so he loved to break dogs. So when he was beating us, he would always say, hear me, you know. So those were things that I didn't want to carry. I wanted to be a chain breaker. I didn't want to bring, because I knew it was wrong. I couldn't figure out, why are we living in fear? Why are we moving? Why is there so much violence and horrible things happening? And I said, that just can't be normal. So in my family that I started with Angie, I was determined to be a chain breaker, and I was determined never to raise my hand and hit my kids, never to emotionally abuse them or browbeat them.
Did you have to fight the impulse to do it at all? Sorry, that's kind of a personal question.
Mitchie, he's our oldest. I think there was a few times that I spanked him, maybe once or twice, you know, spanking, but not the kind that would leave marks.
Sure.
But then I was on the flip side of that, and I could see where Ernie and BJ, those are my biological parents, because the choices they made in their life, they had so much frustration that it felt good to take it out that way.
Sure.
Because they weren't emotionally healthy to be stronger and approach it from a different direction. And if you look at BJ's background of being raised in a Catholic orphanage, Catholics did beat their kids too. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for roller strikes. I mean,
yeah, back in those days, like
that was,
it didn't matter if you were
accepted.
Catholic or not.
Yeah,
like, that was just very
corporal
much the way
punishment
life
in school. I
was.
can remember sitting in school, and the coach would come in, and if someone did something they weren't supposed to, they had that little leather paddle, and off they went, and they came back sniveling. And that was that culture,
right,
in that world. But that, to answer your question directly, to stay on topic, is what I wanted to break. I wanted to be a chain breaker and not continue that illness, that cycle of abuse within my family. So all of our kids are extremely strong-willed. You know them. you know Katie. And I was determined never to squash their spirit of will, of their opinion, of their ability to ask why or say no.
My stepmom always says it's easier to break a spirit than it is to build it.
Yeah, that's true.
And because I also have some kids who are very strong-willed, one in particular who gives me a run for my money, and I have never had to fight anger management urges more in my life than with that child. I mean, there were things that were done in my household growing up too that, you know, I think it's interesting when we grow up this way. I've heard a lot of people say that their default is to go to what they know. And if they know a certain pattern of discipline, that's their default. And to be a chain breaker, you have to consciously decide every single time until it becomes natural and an auto response to choose the opposite of whatever your first gut reaction is. And I think it would be very rare for you if you didn't have those initial thoughts of breathe, right? Like one of the things I learned from my dad was he took an anger management class, and he learned to count to 10 and to like do these deep breaths. And you can still see my dad do it. Even now, he's like 60 something years old. And it's really funny. If one of the grandkids makes him angry, you can see him just go.
He's counting the 10.
And you can see him like counting in the back of his head. But that was something that I learned later, and I've had to use that technique with one of my daughters and to calm myself down, because like you said, right, like you don't want to repeat those things. So do you feel like, back to the original question then, how it sounds like if you were to say that your parents were the perfect parent for you, would it be not that they were perfect or even didn't make mistakes, but that they taught you, gave you a great example of what not to do? Do you feel like you're a better parent in some ways?
Yeah, that's a hard
Not
one.
comparing to other people better
Yeah,
parent. I just mean,
that's the problem, is we like to compare, and we're emotional beings.
Sure.
And we tend to react emotionally. But you know, one of my favorite characters growing up that I just absolutely loved was Spock, because he was emotionless. So I could relate to him of having no emotion. And
did you turn it off?
and turn off, and you wanted to think of things more logical type of a thing. But at the end of the day, I really feel that that's contrary to what is the normal innate drive to have love for your children. So now that I have children, I can't imagine trying to break their will or their little bubble of resistance as a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old. You know, I'm not going to finish this meal just because I don't have to, you know. So
how do you react in that scenario? Like, give me some parent advice here, Mike.
It was
what am I supposed to do?
Because it took two of us. It took Angie and me. And Mitchell, he was our pleasant surprise. And so we were thrown into parenthood, you know, pretty quickly after we got married. All of a sudden, you know, a few months down the line, he's our pleasant surprise. And Mitchell, bless his heart, he had some learning disabilities too. Mm-hmm. He barely got through high school, and you wouldn't know it now. He's successful. He's an executive at a well-known IT company. Cool. But he was my trial to learn how to understand his thought process of learning. And Angie, she, you know, when we got married, I put her through school. I worked full time, and she went to school to get her educational degree and you know, to be a teacher, and emphasized in, I believe, child psychology. So she brought a lot of help to the picture, and she began to realize what I was as a survivor. And then we found a way with gospel principles and learning to control the natural man of taking a breather and working through it and trying to, okay, this line of communication is not working. Violence, unfortunately, does get return behavior if you're successful breaking that person. But then what happens to that soul? Right. You know, they often become addicts. They often become homeless. They often continue that same abuse pattern, that cycle, yeah. in that family. So, you know, like your episode said, you're given by Heavenly Father a child that's really meant for you to interact with and raise because of your abilities. And Ernie and BJ, or mom and dad, I'm sure I was sent to them for a reason. I'm often, and we can talk about this on another day, angry. You know, why me? But then I've realized that maybe that path or that line in my life was innate in me to toughen me to overcome other things or help people survive, and then realize that it's not for me, because I know people that's been through worse. You know,
Angie said something while we were all talking about it in the kitchen that I really liked. She said they had their free agency.
Yeah.
So while you were given to your parents,
there's no guarantee of what their decisions are going to be.
Right. They have their free agency to make decisions and make choices. And unfortunately, children are the innocent bystanders of a lot of these choices. So it's an interesting, I can understand the being angry. I've heard that from multiple people who have told me their stories. And what has helped you? Well, I guess, I don't know if you've found forgiveness, but you've certainly started to feel healing, and you've been able to move past this. If you were to give somebody who was in your same shoes some advice to get to where you are today, what would be some suggestions you would give them to help them
Well,
further their healing?
The thing that comes to mind is when I'm a convert to the church, the song that bothers me the most is "I'm a Child of God." To sit here, and so on and so forth, because that was
Or
not
families can be together forever.
that was not
It's a hard song for
my
people
MO.
who've gone through this. Yeah.
It comes. I would tell you that the most important thing is you move at your pace that makes sense for you. I mean, you don't have to go at a different speed or a different pace to meet any expectations, because pain is very real.
Mhm.
And after my mom passed away and I learned about this, it didn't surprise me that I never heard from her. This was shortly after they had sued us the second time, which is a whole nother story. I've been sued twice, and they had sued Angie.
Mhm.
And we had always tried to make things right and make inroads back, only to be hurt and the sickness, infect us. And that's why we left Texas, because so it's really hard to find forgiveness when you're trying, and then you're kicked in the teeth.
Sure.
And then
Oh,
you're trying and you're
absolutely.
kicked in the teeth. And so this has been a repetitive injury list that I could go on with countless stories that go back to a very young age of my first memory of 5 and 6. But to answer your question, how do you forgive? I think it's at your pace. I think it's understanding the atonement that Jesus Christ has suffered the same thing, and the same fears and the same disappointments, the same longing of escape, of wanting to get away, to have peace in your heart. But why can't you have peace? Why is the anxiety so constant? Because of fear of consequences, But Angie understands that. But we've been married 30 plus years, and it's taken a long time, and it hasn't been an easy ride for her. But she's helped me try to forgive, because Angie just loves everybody.
She's such a sweetheart.
And she's always, well, what are their thought processes, and why did they do that? What caused them to do that? So that helps a lot.
Did that help you kind
Yeah.
of putting yourself, understanding your mom's background and kind of what she went through,
Yeah.
causing some of this?
Yeah. Well, and I've come to realize that I could just remember countless discussions of manipulation, and I think that she sincerely had, and it wasn't obvious, but I think she had some learning disabilities. I don't think she knew how to read and write completely. And I think she was a survivor in her own way of bouncing around between less than men, I call them, that are abusive and all about them. And so it would seem that those people you see in those patterns, they bounce from one marriage to another. It's a little different spice, but it's still pepper, and it's still an abusive relationship.
Did finding you keep talking about your faith and the church that you belong to, did joining this church and finding a relationship with God help with your healing? Like, was that a big part of it?
Well, this is going to sound odd, but I'm old enough to remember Oral Roberts University and all these Baptists and all this stuff. And so my folks were religious, but it was out of fear. You're going to do this, or you're going to burn in hell. You're going to suffer, and you're going to wail and gnash your teeth. Or there's a girl that's pregnant, because
that's spiritual abuse. Actually, is what that is.
So I went through all that, where I didn't even really like the word church, but because it was a form of punishment. God is doing this to you, and here's just one other source other than my immediate parents, that if I don't perform, I'm going to be punished and suffer. So it wasn't only me that joined the church, my whole family did.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And that's another story. But it became evident why Ernie BJ joined, because of the church welfare system.
Oh, okay.
And but when we wound up in San Antonio, I was so desperate to get away from this lifestyle. I wanted a scholarship in basketball, but I kept with injuries. The church mission was my escape, and I went on a church mission for all the wrong reasons. But my bishop knew this, and my bishop wanted me to go on a mission because he knew that I would begin to understand atonement. And that's probably where I began to understand that there is a kind God, that he's not, biblically going to punish you and swallow you up in sand of flesh-eating ants because of mistakes. And so after escaping from that brainwash world, of what my thought patterns were formed to be, I began to realize, hey, maybe religion is something. And I knew the church was true before I went on my mission. I always believed that, but I didn't realize to the extent of what the atonement can do. And the atonement is just not about repentance. To me, that's half of what atonement means. The other half is trying to heal and realize that not all sources in life are dark. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you guys, is an extreme example where if you're parenting like that, you're going to need a lot of help. But I suspect that people that belong to this community and watch this type of thing, you're generally good people that want to do the very best that you can, and you feel horrible if you have a perception of falling short. If that is true, if you are falling short, children are very resilient. And I understand I'm a very uncommon survivor. My sisters struggle with alcoholism. They're not active in the church. I've seen patterns with their behaviors that's very sickening to me when I go visit them in Arizona, of things that BJ would say and do to the kids. So you see, they haven't quite broke that pattern, but I don't hold them responsible for that, because honestly, they have a learning disability. And that's not uncommon with identical twins.
So what I'm hearing is some of the best advice that we could receive is consciously decide that you're going to be a chain breaker.
Yeah.
Make that decision, and then actively work on doing the things that you need to do to be a chain breaker, whether that's becoming active in your church and studying the atonement and understanding that the crucifixion and suffering in the garden and rising again, all of those, that's the atonement, the 3 parts, right? And realizing what that means for you personally, making strides to do things differently than your parents did, learning from their mistakes so that you don't repeat those and become a cycle breaker, doing things that are healthy for you, both physically and emotionally. He works out 2 hours a day, which is awesome. That keeps you healthy physically. And when you're healthy physically, you can have more of a healthy mental brain. We'll be doing more videos about that another time, but there's a big connection there. And I'm also hearing relying on your spouse, if you have one, to help you, to help in that healing process. And not, speaking of spouses, my spouse is calling him. This is hilarious. Anyway, so I think this is great advice, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate you being willing to share, and
Sure.
We'll bring you back another time to talk more about your dad and some of the crazy stuff that went on there. And if you have any questions for Mike, things that you'd like him to talk about, write in the comments, send me a message. A lot of you guys send me personal text messages or personal messages on Facebook. Join our community if you haven't done so already. The link's down below. the community right now is only open to women to keep that a safe place for them. But if you are a man watching this, you can join us through Messenger, and we can connect the other ways. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Like the
More than happy
video,
to.
subscribe, share, do all those things. It helps us spread these messages of encouragement and hope and love. And thank you so much, you guys, for watching. What do you think? And there must be an emergency going on because he's called like 6 times. So I'm gonna say goodbye to everybody. We love you. Thank you so much.